Sweet. Okay, cool. I'm here with Mike Powers. Mike is back once again, has an excellent story. And this is actually like in a very exciting moment for me because I've never been granted permission to read a story before it's come out and talk about it on the podcast. So this is like history in the making
Yeah.
here. Um, your story, the reason I really like it is because excuse me, in 20, I think it was 2018, I kind of tried to do a similar story with Pulse and it ended up getting scrapped because yours is much better than mine was going to be. But it was similar on like the note of when an artist does something bad, what does that mean for the art? And like,
hmm
what do you do moving on from there? Is it, is the intention of the art by the artist the only thing that matters? And so that was kind of the angle I was taking. But like I said, I think you did a much better job of talking about like how subjective ethics really are and that people's ethics vary from person to person. And I just really liked the perspective angle that you took on it. Where did the well, first of all, do you want to tell us a little bit about the story and just what it's about? Because I know nobody has had the opportunity to read it yet.
Yeah, I think I can. I don't know when you're planning on posting this, so if it's before it comes out, I'm gonna. The title is, if I remember, God, if I remember it, it's art as ethics, as politics, as media, as art. So that's
Yeah,
that's the name.
it's a great title.
Sorry to my editor if this is coming out before it's released, but I'm sure that will be fine. Yeah, I don't know. I've kind of felt like over the past couple years, I haven't felt very satisfied with the um, attitudes around kind of art and media online, where it seems to me at least that when we have people, whether it's musicians or actors or YouTubers or like TikTokers, right? I think they all function really similarly. When they do things that we don't like, or when their art or media or whatever it is says something that we don't like, it seems to me like the response to that is usually to just scorn them and like completely dismiss anything that they've ever done. And like, um, I don't want, God, I hate to use the word cancel, but like cancel them. Right.
Yeah,
And I don't really like that too much. And so I wanted to take the opportunity in this story to interview some people who know more about this type of stuff than I do and get some other perspectives on kind of what to do with art and media that's made by people who we disagree with or who do things that are maybe not so great. So that was kind of where the idea came from.
absolutely, absolutely. And the first major, well, you use like Morgan Wallen as an example, but one of the first major examples you used was Harvey Weinstein, and you said like, what do we do with movies like Django Unchained, Inglorious Bastards, these movies that are pretty much recognized as masterpieces, but they were produced by the Weinstein Company. And personally speaking, some of my favorite movies were produced by the Weinstein Company, and I can't change the fact that I love those movies. You can't change the fact that they're a beautiful expression of art. And I also love how you pointed out that if you just go ahead and cancel everything that Weinstein did, you're also canceling the work of hundreds, potentially thousands of other people that put a lot of time into this. Every person that was on the crew, every person that went into post production, the actors, every single person. So I love that you pointed that out. That this isn't just the work of one person, even if their name is the first thing you see on the screen um,
Right.
when it's
Yeah.
starting.
Emily Raleigh, who is a theater professor at Central, kind of gave me the idea to go down that road a little bit more. And I do feel obligated to say, like, okay, I'm really not trying to white knight for Harvey Weinstein here. Like, I don't think that I'm not interested in defending Harvey Weinstein. But she did give me kind of that perspective of like, she was talking about it more from how she continues to enjoy media from people. She was talking specifically about Joss Whedon, with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She still really likes that show, and when she's watching it, she can go through and say, well, I don't really like Joss Whedon that much, but I can really appreciate what the actors were doing, right? I can really appreciate what the writers were doing, the cinematographers, right? Like there's a lot of other lenses through which we can engage with art and media besides uh, just the Harvey Weinstein made this type lens or something like that.
Absolutely, and you could apply that to obviously all art, but also anything that you can purchase, anything you can enjoy. If you don't agree with, if you're not a huge fan of Elon Musk, does that mean you shouldn't own a Tesla? If you're not a huge fan of, well, anything at all, does that mean you shouldn't participate in it? Does that mean you shouldn't be allowed to enjoy it? I don't think so, and I think that your story here really highlights um, exactly why. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's necessary to stop enjoying that art or consuming whatever that product may be. Um,
Yeah, I think it's definitely more. I think it needs to be more of a case by case consideration than maybe our online culture is really, maybe then more so than what our online culture currently allows it to be, right? Like, um, because I guess in the, if you in the Tesla example, like, okay, yes, but also if you buy a Tesla, like, aren't you kind of directly funding Elon Musk? There's all these other considerations, but I think what I would like to kind of get across with this piece is that, yeah, there's all these other considerations, but we should consider them, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that requires a little bit more of a case by case basis sometimes, in considering what we want to do with art and media, than really we have seen in the last 3 years.
Yes, I agree. And the two quotes that really stood out to me in this piece, one was from you, and the other one was from Aleem. Is that, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but
Yeah.
um, Aleem said, "We need room to be able to view art from multiple angles at the same time." And that was, to me, that was like a staple in this piece. That's kind of what it all revolved around, is that there are multiple angles, there are multiple perspectives. And then the quote from you that I really like that you wrote was, "It's worth considering that art made from a perspective not your own is not inherently and irredeemably bad." And that was like, you used as an example, like white wine moms might not love hip hop culture, and they might hear their kids listening to some rap song that they're not really, they think, why this has you know the content of this song I don't like agree with, but they're not taking into example, or they're not taking into consideration the perspective of the writer, the type of environment they're from. Those are all things that have to be considered, when you're looking at a piece of art. This might not make sense from my perspective, but it's not about my perspective as a consumer. It's not just about my perspective as a consumer. It's also
Right.
about the perspective of the artist and the perspective of the other people that enjoy the art.
Right. And I think if you do run into cases like that where you're like, man, I don't really like this, or this doesn't, if it's not for you, then maybe it's just not for you. Like,
Hmm.
and that doesn't mean that it's bad, but it just maybe means that, uh I think it means that we as consumers and audience members need to kind of figure out what our own boundaries are a little bit more. And I think take a little bit more responsibility on our end to consider, like, well, maybe this isn't for me. And maybe that means that I'm just not going to watch it or listen to it or engage with it. But that's just because it, you know, doesn't really gel with my values. But that doesn't mean that it's bad, right? I don't know.
Yeah, and it is interesting that that is kind of a, that has to be pointed out in this time, because at some point I'm sure that was kind of the norm, but we have our generation has so much access to different things all the time, and like, if you're on social media, you get to see perspectives from other people's lives that maybe not have been how it was in the way you grew up or the way you currently live. And the same goes for art. Like, you're not, maybe 50 years ago or 100 years ago, when you might only be exposed to the things that are physically around you. But now we just have so much access to these things. You're seeing all these different perspectives, and most of them aren't going to be similar to the one that your own perspective.
Right.
Um, yeah, and I think that is necessary to point out, and it's also interesting that we have to remember that, because at one point that was the norm for a long time, and now that there's so much access, we live in the information age. We have to remember just how many perspectives there are, how many different sets of ethics there are. For as many people as there are, that's how many different sets of ethics there are. I like that you pointed that out a few times throughout the piece, is that every single person has a different set of ethics and morals, and your own are only your own, and probably shared by others there's people probably share similar ethics to you, but there's just because you can't understand something or just because something doesn't necessarily align with your morals doesn't mean that it won't align with anyone's.
Right. Right. Well, and I think like what you're saying with just the sheer amount of information that we have access to now, I feel like what this kind of all boils down to for me at least is just like increased media literacy. I think that's really um what's needed because all the all the people watching this who are like musicians or filmmakers or writers or whatever are going to hate that I'm saying this probably, but like I feel like art at this point is like art is media and media is like it's kind of all just the same, right? Especially when it's all distributed online.
Mhm.
Like, you know, a YouTube video versus a song versus an Instagram post versus a film, like they all share very similar um functions, I think. And so I guess I'm just I think that when we think about um, engaging with art, and I think a lot of it boils down to thinking of it as media literacy. Uh, I think.
Absolutely. I think media literacy is one of the most important things that nobody knows. Like it's
Yeah, it is. It is kind of one of those like it's like you're right. It kind of reminds me of like critical thinking. It's like okay, what is critical thinking, right? You're
yeah,
right. I guess media literacy that is kind of a really broad word a little bit. Um,
it is, but like it's something that you and I have learned about through what we do. And then once you learn about this, you're like, this needs to be some everybody consumes media. Everybody should learn, critical thinking skills in media, which is media literacy.
mhm,
That should be something everybody is taught, but it's definitely not. And it's something like it's to me probably the most valuable thing I learned in my education,
mhm.
but
Yeah.
it's not a common thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like for me, media literacy kind of comes down to a little bit what we've already talked about, like looking like, okay, who's the intended audience? You know, like what's the who's saying this, right? Who's it for? Who's it coming from? Like, just it takes like 5 minutes to just think about like who's the audience, who's saying this, is it for me? I don't know. It's kind of the stuff we've already talked about a little bit, but I feel like that's where I start with thinking about media literacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's widened too because like one of the most recent, I don't know if you'd call it a scandal, but I think it was like Kamala Harris's daughter that was like that got caught like taking a picture that looked like it was a selfie, but then it was actually a person, like she was holding a phone up to make it look like it was a selfie, but it's actually a person taking a picture of her with like another camera. And like that to me was like something that you don't realize that without media literacy because you realize like, oh, like what is the person posting that picture to gain? So like media literacy has expanded too to like social media
Hmm.
and all forms of art and things like that because you're right, it is all online. And it's like you know, like when I saw somebody kind of like expose that, like, look, it's not even a selfie. They're just it's a trend now of people taking pictures that look like they're like mirror pictures, but there's no mirror actually around. Things like that made me realize, like, okay, every time you see somebody post anything, you have to think about why what do they stand to gain from this. I'm not saying everything is fake, I'm not going to go that deep, but like a lot of things are more staged or there's more to be gained by the person doing it than you would think. And
Hmm.
we're getting a little bit off topic here, but like
That's okay. No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, and it's hard because it's like, God, that sounds so boring. Having to scroll through my Instagram feed and think like about every post, like, well, what's really going on here? Like, I
yeah.
don't want to do that. And yeah, I feel like with this, I don't know if you want to bring it back in, you know, with the story, I feel like I don't know. I hope I that was the kind of tone that I was trying to take of like, look, I know that this is so like no one wants to answer the question, what does it mean to be an ethical consumer of art? Like I hear that question and I just want to gag. But
Yeah.
like but okay, like maybe it is worth thinking about. You know,
Mhm.
just for like just a little bit, just for like 5 minutes, right? Just for like 10 minutes, just consider it.
Well, yeah, and since people haven't had the chance to read it yet, probably based on when this is posted,
Yeah.
um, what do you think about? I know that's a very hard question to answer, but what do you think it's possible to be an ethical consumer of art? Do you think it's just more complicated than that?
I was really part of me was really hoping that you weren't going to ask that, because I
I'm
feel like
sorry.
the whole point of this story was for me to not have to actually answer that and just get to say, here's what other people think. But then the other half of me is like, of course I was going to get asked that. Like,
I know.
duh, Mike. Yeah. I think that I hope that there are some common ground ethics that we can all agree upon. Like Harvey Weinstein, not a great person. Like, I hope we can all agree that, like, to engage with the type of movies that he's produced, like, it is probably at least a good idea to recognize, right, that Harvey Weinstein is not a good person before you, like, go watch a movie or something. I don't know, like I hope that there are some baseline ethical values that we all hold. um but anything beyond of, like, sexually assaulting people, or these really kind of across the board not good things, like, I think we just need a little bit more room to consider, yeah, that, like, not everyone holds the same ethics or the same values or morals. And so beyond that, I guess I don't know what an ethical consumer of art honestly looks like if you start to zoom out or zoom in even a little bit, just because of the variance in people's morals and personal moral codes. um
Absolutely. Oh, I think one thing that I learned when I was trying to write, I really tried to write the story that you wrote, and
it's
it was
yeah, it's
hot garbage.
it
Like,
was it's yeah, it's well, because you start, I don't know if you ran into this, but, like, you start writing it and you're like, oh, this is actually really a lot bigger than maybe I
yeah, it was
thought it
like
was.
I
Oops.
thought I had a thesis or something, but it's like I don't know what I'm
Yeah.
even doing. But one of the people I interviewed, Matt Altman, who is a
Yeah.
professor of philosophy at Central, and he introduced me to this concept called the intentional fallacy, which is, and I'm sorry to anybody who knows philosophy that I don't know, that I might be butchering this, but it was basically like an artist's in like a piece of art has its own life, and the intention of the artist making it should be considered. However, once you produce a piece of art, it now takes on its own life. And if it means something different to the consumer than it did from the creator, then that is also just as valid. The art isn't only what it was meant to be by the creator, and it also isn't equivalent with. So, like, if you essentially, like, if you're a fan of an artist, like a musical artist who is like who did something bad, or a comedian who did something bad or something like that, um the life of that art isn't equal to the life of the person who created that art. So you shouldn't feel bad about something that you think you just subjectively like. Like, everybody loves Ignition by R. Kelly. Everybody loves that song. R. Kelly is a terrible person, but everybody loves that song. Um, the Cosby Show broke a lot of barriers in television, um, for people of color, but Bill
Hmm.
Cosby's a terrible person. These things. The Cosby Show has its own life. Ignition by R. Kelly has its own life as a piece of art. That being said, the person who created it is terrible. That doesn't mean everything he created ever was terrible. Sorry if
Right.
that's not what the intentional fallacy is, philosophy nuts. I'm sorry, but that's how I understood it. Um,
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to uh this issue, like this idea of platforming too. It's like, like, we can also think about, like, okay, well, who do we really want to be platforming? Like, because there's a difference between listening to an R. Kelly song, like, privately, like, for just your personal enjoyment, and, like, platforming R. Kelly, like, in the public sphere, right? Which is when I
sure.
think this question of, like, I think that's just when it gets more complicated. Of, like, okay, like, is this really the type of person we want to be, like, advertising on a billboard or something, right?
Hmm.
Um, I also think, yeah, I think the intent thing is something that's, I think we've really swung the pendulum a little bit too far, right? With the worst phrase in the English language, which is cancel culture. Which, what does that
Oh
even
God.
mean? But, like, because I think a lot of people have. Uh, Rightly so, over the past few years, really tried to focus more on the impact that people's actions or art or whatever it is makes, as opposed to their intent. Um, but I definitely I don't know if you agree with this, but I definitely think the pendulum is maybe swung a little far right, where now we're not considering the intent of artists or media creators or whatever it is, and instead saying, well, because the impact was harmful to me, I'm going to kind of reverse apply that and say that you intended it to be impactful or
Yeah,
offensive or whatever, and therefore you're a bad person. When in reality, it's like, okay, like we need to consider the impact of our words or our actions or our art or whatever it is, but I think we do also need to consider the intent, because if someone didn't intend for something to be harmful or offensive, I mean, and that's a different story than if they intended for something to be harmful, offensive,
yeah,
detrimental, things like that.
absolutely. I think like bad things are bad things, but it also does it carries a little more weight if it was meant to be hurtful. It carries a little
Right.
more weight if it's like this was created as like a weapon of some sort, like an abstract weapon
Yeah.
to harm people.
And
But if it
and I
wasn't,
sus sorry, go on.
no, you're good. I was just gonna say if it wasn't created as that, but it turns out to be that, it's still bad. But it does carry a little more weight when it was totally intended to be harmful versus when it was a little bit accidental.
Yeah, and I suspect that a lot of the things that we criticize as being harmful were not intended to be so.
Yeah.
To the degree that I think a lot of people claim they are.
Mhm.
Yeah, I that's my sneaking suspicion here.
Yeah. Well, like, I mean, the biggest example I can think of is like a lot of people really enjoy the Joe Rogan podcast, and a lot of people really, really hate the Joe Rogan podcast. And it's like the arguments on both sides are both valid, I think. Like it's
I have never listened to the Joe Rogan podcast, and like this like Joe Rogan seems to be a I don't know anything about him, and I need to listen to so I know what I'm talking about, because this type of conversation about Joe Rogan keeps coming up, and
yeah.
I know literally nothing about him.
Well, it's like I think what I mostly hear is like some people are like, I just like this podcast that's about like monkeys and psychedelics. And then the
Mhm.
other people are like, yeah, but he says things and he has this massive platform and he's kind of an idiot and he kind of makes a mess of things a lot of times. And other people are like, sure, but we don't watch it for that. We watch it because he had somebody on that I liked and I watched it for that person. And it's like, so that was an example of something that was not intended to be that was not, I'm sure he didn't create that thinking like I'm going to influence an election. No, he didn't. I guarantee you he didn't start that podcast thinking he was going to have any kind of negative impacts on anybody. It was probably just for fun, but it grew to be the biggest podcast in the world. It's probably why podcasts are so prevalent now. So exactly, that's the example I think of when you say some people create things without negative intention that then end up having a little bit of a negative impact on the world. And
Yeah,
the
again,
question
I
is,
kind of go back to that question of platform, because I do think that the larger your platform gets, right, in this balance between like art and politics, like I think that the larger your platform gets, right, maybe it starts to balance a little bit more towards politics perhaps, right?
mhm,
Like there's definitely different considerations for someone with Joe Rogan's platform than with this podcast, right? Um so again, maybe it kind of goes back to that case by case consideration, right? Joe Rogan's platform is a lot larger than this podcast.
you don't say.
Sorry, Jared. Yeah, but
So no,
and
I'm not
so I
offended.
think it's worth considering what does that mean for for the media itself, or um, how does that change how Joe Rogan should and shouldn't use his platform considering its size? I don't know, because
Yeah,
I am ignorant in this and have never watched Joe Rogan and don't know anything about him besides what I've heard through the grapevine. So
yeah. Well,
I better go get an opinion on that.
no, your principle is correct though. Absolutely. Like to quote Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
So like, if, whether you ask for that responsibility or not, and then to loop it all back, like if you create a piece of art, be it music or physical, like art that you look at or whatever it is, art has power too. And like, if you're one of the, especially if you're one of the like big time artists that's creating something, acknowledgement that you have a little bit of a responsibility would be nice. But that being said, most people I don't think make their art with intention to do anything bad. Well, I don't know if I want to say that. I think most people make art because they have a passion for creating and they want to make a copy of something that's in their mind that we can all see or
Yeah.
hear. And that's really what most of it I think comes down to. And then if it turns out to have a negative impact, I don't think most of the time that was what it was created for. But that being, then that's where the argument is it
Yeah, then it's like, is that, yeah.
that just brings us all
One,
back to the argument.
and I think it's difficult too because as as critics, right? We only really have the impact to judge. I mean, like the artist can say I didn't intend for it to be this way, but like, if you're being a little bit more skeptical about it, right? Like you don't really know that for sure. And so I think maybe one reason that we tend to way more on the impact side is because that's where the more concrete kind of evidence is,
Mhm.
right? It's a lot easier to measure the impact of something than to measure the person who created it, measure their intent, which is a little bit
Absolutely.
more subjective. And
Well,
yeah,
it's immeasurable almost. It's just you kind of just it's a guessing game a lot of
yeah,
times, and it's immeasurable almost. But um, before we end this, because we're getting a little
we're getting
late, but I want to talk about like your interviews here and like how did you choose, excuse me, who to speak to about these
oh yeah.
issues? Like this is such a hard thing. Like nobody seems to be necessarily an expert on this, but you chose people that had really valuable input. And how did
Hmm.
you choose like who to talk
Well,
to?
yeah, well, I first wanted to think, I thought more about kind of the industries that I wanted to represent. And just because a lot of this conversation, I think, really does root back to Harvey Weinstein and Me Too from 2017, I knew that I wanted to talk with some people from film.
Mhm.
So I just kind of, I mean, for that, I just searched around and was like, who in the area, who could I reach out to? And I found the Northwest Film Center and looked up some of their stuff. And Amy Dotson is the director of that. She also is the curator for media at the Portland Art Museum. So I thought she'd have a nice perspective on kind of art and media more broadly. Mike Ward is a local Pacific Northwest film reviewer that I followed for a couple of years now. So I kind of just already knew about him, and I knew that he also was big into kind of pop culture and pop music as well. So I thought that he'd have some good perspectives on, again, film, but also media more generally. And then who else did I have on there? Emily Raleigh. That one I kind of was just like, let's get someone from Central. I don't know. Let's look through here.
Yeah,
And we hadn't really, like, I kind of looked through Pulse's archives, and we don't really do a lot with theater. Like we haven't done too much topics, interviews, features on theater, and so I thought that that might be a nice diverse perspective to get.
absolutely.
Um, and then for Vanessa Aguirre, I follow her on Twitter. She's a music reviewer that I like, and she's kind of out on the East Coast. And so she was just more someone where I was like, yeah, I just know her. I like what she does. Let's just get her on here. Um, and she also is someone who is a music critic. She has a platform, or she right she does platform people, even if she's not like writing for the New York Times, right? I figured that that issue of platforming might be a consideration for her. And then for Zishan Alim, I knew that I wanted to get someone with a bit more of a political media perspective that wasn't maybe as involved with art per se. And I had actually come across him because he had this great Twitter thread on this concept of his called disinterpretation that I really liked, where he was basically theorizing of like, why is it so hard to have a good faith debate online? And he went through and he's like, here's what I think, basically. And I just thought that his thoughts on that really aligned well with kind of what I was trying to get across in this story. So I thought that he would be a good person to interview.
Well, I just think you had such a healthy mix of perspectives, and that was an important part of the story. Is just the perspective being like a key element of the story. Like you chose really great people to talk to, and I'm surprised. I thought maybe you talked to a couple of them, but you were like citing them from other things. But to hear that you actually spoke to all of these guys or interviewed them or however you did it, that's pretty impressive because you know that's hard to do as a student journalist in a school the size of ours. So hats off to you
Yeah,
for that one.
I mean, there were a handful of people who did not respond.
Okay, well that's
Which
fair.
not to say I'm really thankful for the people who did respond and I got to interview. I wouldn't have anyone else for this story, right? But yeah, there were a lot of people who didn't respond. But I don't know. I feel like I think people are too afraid of cold emailing and cold calling. Literally everyone on this I just DM'd on Twitter. I was like, "Hey, I'm a student. Like, will you please, and can I interview you for this story?" And pretty much everyone was like, "Yeah, sure. I've got 10 minutes, 20 minutes tomorrow night. You down?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure, great."
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I feel like with sources, a lot of it is just reaching out and like getting a couple no's, right? But I think a lot of people are pretty excited to share and give back.
Yeah, everybody wants to tell their story, and that's the
Yeah, everyone
best.
wants to have the spotlight for
Yeah, and that's our best
half a
friend
page.
as for what we do.
Yeah.
But anyway, Mike, this was a fantastic. I can't wait for this to hit the shelves. And
Yeah,
what do you know?
this one will be an online exclusive, so it's not printed in the Pulse publication this quarter. It'll be on our website.
That makes sense because I saw the hyperlinks on there, and I was like, I wonder how they're going to do that on
Are they
print.
gonna? Yeah, no, it'll be online.
Okay, cool. So, do you know when the release date is for the new issue?
I don't know the release date. Just yesterday, we went through and final proofed the entire magazine as a class. So it goes to print very soon, but I don't know the exact release date. But it will be. It'll be soon.
Okay. Well, you guys, by the end of the quarter, the new Pulse will be out. Please read Mike's story, and it's art as I don't want to get the order wrong.
Art as ethics, as politics, as media, as art.
I love the title. You guys can't miss it. It is online. I'll share it on social media, and Pulse will too. And yeah, go read this as soon as possible. It's a very healthy and refreshing perspective, I think, on the issue. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. You're always welcome. It's always good to have you.
Cool. Thanks, Jared.
Anytime. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. I know it's a little bit of a long one, and we'll be back, I think, at least one more time before the end of the quarter. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys later.